All right, today we are tackling one of the heaviest hitters in American history, Brown v. Board of Education. This wasn't just some dusty old court case, it was a legal earthquake, and its aftershocks are still felt today. So let's get into it and see how this whole thing went down.
But to really get what happened in 1954, we've actually got to rewind the clock way back to 1896. Now look at this quote. A Supreme Court justice said this, arguing that the Constitution is colorblind. Pretty powerful stuff, right? The crazy part is, he was the only one who thought so at the time. So the big question is, if someone was saying this back in 1896, why did it take almost 60 more years for that idea to finally win?
And that brings us to our first section, the law of separation. Because to really appreciate how revolutionary Brown was, you have to understand the enormous legal mountain it was up against. And this timeline really puts that mountain into perspective. For 58 years, I mean, think about that. That's almost 6 decades. The law of the land was set by this one case, Plessy v. Ferguson. This wasn't just a social custom. It was a legal doctrine approved by the highest court that basically cemented segregation into the fabric of American life. So what was this doctrine? It had a name that sounded kind of fair, separate but equal. The idea was, hey, you can keep the races separate, as long as the schools, the train cars, the water fountains, as long as they were all equal in quality. But, while that was the theory, the reality was anything but. It was basically a legal loophole used to justify massive inequality. The vote in that Plessy case wasn't even close. It was 7-1 in favor of segregation. But then there was that one guy, Justice Harlan, the lone voice in the wilderness. He called it what it was, a law that was hostile to the entire spirit of the Constitution. He lost the argument then, but he planted a legal seed that would eventually grow into something powerful. But of course, this whole thing wasn't just about abstract legal arguments. It was about real people, real families, and in this case, a father's fight for his daughter. And this is where it all becomes so incredibly real. Meet Linda Brown. She's just a little kid in elementary school. To get to her school, the one for black children, she has to walk 6 blocks just to get to a bus stop, to then travel another mile. Meanwhile, there was a school for white children just 7 blocks from her front door. It's that simple, daily injustice, that feeling of this just isn't right, that lit the fuse for this entire case. And it's so important to know that it wasn't just the Brown family. Their case was actually the headliner for 5 different lawsuits, all bundled together. You had families from South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, D.C., and Kansas. This whole thing was a coordinated, strategic legal assault led by the NAACP and their lead attorney, a guy you might have heard of, Thurgood Marshall. This was a national movement.
So all these fights, all these families, all this legal strategy, it all finally came to a head at the Supreme Court, the moment of truth.
And the outcome was absolutely stunning. The court ruled 9-0, unanimous. And that was no accident. The new Chief Justice Earl Warren, he knew this decision would be a political bombshell. He worked like crazy behind the scenes to make sure every single justice signed on, because he understood that to change the country, the court had to speak with one single, undeniable voice. And here they are, the words that changed America. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now that word, inherently, that's the whole ballgame. The court wasn't just saying the schools were unequal because one had fewer books or older buildings. They were saying that the very act of separating children by race makes the schools unequal. Period.
So how'd they reach that conclusion? This is the truly revolutionary part. They moved beyond just looking at the physical stuff, the buildings, the teachers, the books. They looked at the psychological damage. They used social science studies to argue that separating children by law sends a message that one group is inferior. And that message, they said, can harm a child's heart and mind in a way that might never be fixed.
So, the court has spoken. Segregation in schools is unconstitutional. Huge victory, right? Well, yes. But winning the legal battle was one thing. Winning the war on the ground was going to be something else entirely. So a year later, the court issues a second ruling. We call it Brown 2, to answer the question, okay, so now what? And their instruction was for schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. It's a phrase that sounds kind of nice and reasonable, but its vagueness would cause a world of problems.
I mean, seriously, what does all deliberate speed actually mean? How fast is speed? How slow is deliberate? For people who wanted to keep segregation, this ambiguity was a gift. It was a giant loophole they could use to delay, install, and fight against the ruling for years, and even decades.
And resist they did. What followed was an era of intense and often violent backlash. In Virginia, politicians organized what they proudly called massive resistance, literally shutting down public schools to avoid integration. In Arkansas, the President of the United States had to send in federal troops just to walk 9 black teenagers into their high school. And in Alabama, a governor physically stood in a schoolhouse door to try and block black students from entering. All deliberate speed had run into a brick wall of all deliberate resistance.
And that intense struggle brings us to today. Because the story of Brown v. Board of Education isn't really over. Its legacy is something we're still living with and still arguing about.
And here is the key to understanding why the conversation is still going. Brown delivered a knockout blow to what's called de jure segregation, that segregation that's written into the law. It made that illegal. But it couldn't, on its own, erase de facto segregation, the kind that just exists in reality because of things like housing patterns and wealth gaps and other deep social issues. You see, you can change a law with the stroke of a pen. Changing a whole society, that takes a lot longer.
So in the end, we're left with this powerful idea. The court case in 1954 made a promise. It was a promise of equality. But as we all know, a promise made is not the same as a promise kept. The ruling ended legal segregation, but the hard work of building truly integrated, truly equal schools, that work continues. And it leaves all of us with a question that's just as urgent now as it was then. How do we finally fully fulfill the promise of Brown?